Hello, everyone. This is Jason Zeidema. I'm glad that you're all here for this last week of the internship training webinar. This week, I'm very pleased to have Mr. Michael Skaggs with us. Michael Skaggs has been the executive assistant at NAMMA for the last year and has been involved in a number of important projects. One of the fun projects he's been involved in is being the editor of the Maori Report magazine. You all received a copy of that a few weeks back at the NAMMA conference. I think it's really great work, and so I'm happy that he's involved in that work. Unfortunately, he couldn't be with us at the NAMMA conference. It would have been great to have him there. Hopefully, he'll be with us at another meeting in the coming year. But one of the projects that he's been working on is trying to understand one part of building capacity, and that is what are called port levies or voluntary contributions that ships give when they visit ports. There had been some international work on this in the past few years done by some partners at ISWAN, and a few of our different seafarer centers were involved in that particular work. But that was a global view of the work, and what we needed was something more focused on the United States and Canada, something that will be useful for the work here, something that will help us specifically build our capacity. So, Michael, thank you for being with us, and I would love it if you could present your work to us in the coming few minutes.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Jason, for that introduction. And I'll just follow on briefly with a short introduction to this project. It does give a much fuller picture of the North American situation as opposed to the international situation. And I would encourage you to read that report by ISWAN. I think it's called Port Levies and Sustainable Welfare. And it gives a very interesting overview of how the systems that we're going to be talking about today work in other parts of the world. But as you will see as we move through the results of the survey that we conducted, it's much different in North America in various ways, and so we'll get at some of those details as we move through the presentation. A couple of guiding questions for this survey, beyond the technical questions that were asked of each respondent, but we wanted to know, how is the shipping industry contributing to the upkeep of seafarers' welfare organizations? What is the relationship between those organizations and shipping ownership, port authorities, those sorts of stakeholders? Where those relationships and systems are working well, why is it working so well? And where things could be better, what are the weaknesses there, and what can we look to in the future in terms of improving those systems? Now, just a couple of caveats as we begin this is not a scientific survey. I'm not a sociologist. I'm not a statistician, and so this is sort of a very straightforward, blunt survey, if that's an appropriate word here. And you will see as we move through here the signs of that. But in any case, we still have some very useful indications of what the situation is in North America. So let's just jump right into the findings of the survey. The first thing that we asked all of our centers that we contacted, and as you can see here, we contacted 69 centers for this survey. Does your port have a welfare levy, or do you administer a voluntary contribution? Those two terms are very technical and very specific. Levy technically implies that a charge is mandatory upon a ship every time it calls at port, as opposed to a voluntary contribution, which is a shipping agent or ownership just sort of making a donation to the welfare organization in the port of their own goodwill. But in any case, the purpose of this question was to gauge, essentially, is there a system by which shipping can contribute to your upkeep in your port? As you can see here, there is a large plurality where there is no sort of levy, there is no sort of voluntary contribution scheme. It's just sort of the center is operating on its own funding from its various sources, and there is no relationship with shipping. About a quarter of the centers contacted send out their own invoices to solicit contributions from shipping, and then in a little bit below 20% of the cases, the port authority does some sort of collection of this support. And then there is a very small number there of centers that did it in the past or have plans to in the future, but don't at present. That in itself, that very small wedge, is very important because there are a couple different reasons that there are not levies. In some cases, it just hasn't occurred to the various people involved, and so they don't have those systems. In other cases, there will maybe be a lack of an advocate on a Port Authority board. One thing that I heard in a few cases was that there were motions for formal levies to be put into place, or there were actors on Port Authority directors boards that were trying to get these systems running, but those people move on, they retire, they die, and so losing an advocate in those situations can be an impediment to this sort of collection. In other cases, lines that contributed to the upkeep of seafarers' welfare would stop calling at that particular port, not because of the welfare contributions, but just for various reasons they would not use that port anymore, and so that source of income would disappear as well. And then in a great many cases, there is no sort of scheme in place either on the part of the Port Authority or the welfare centers directly, because this is perceived in some cases to be an impediment to competitiveness on the part of the port. And so the impression is if we try to get shipping to contribute to what we're doing here, it's going to make the port look much less competitive, and that's basically a bad thing for all people involved. A correlated question to that is who is actually doing the invoicing or making the request for contributions. In the majority of cases, we have centers or ministries making these requests, and in other cases, the Port Authority is doing it on behalf of the welfare organizations. We do lose a little bit of the richness of the data set here with only 36 people having this sort of system in place, and so really 36 is the subset. When we move on to the collections technique and the collection systems, that's how many we're talking about in doing this system. How much is requested? This begins to give us a picture of how much shipping support of welfare services actually makes a difference to the operation of centers. 33 gave us a exact amount ranging from $20, 20 US dollars all the way up to 200, and then some of those outliers in there that are odd numbers like 28 and 32, that's from the conversion from Canadian dollars to American dollars. On average, they're requesting just under $81. 80 is right there at the median. Most frequently, the amount requested is $100. And as we'll see as we move on farther into the survey, how that amount requested correlates to how frequently it gets paid is a very significant thing to consider. But for right now, we've got amounts ranging from $20 all the way up to $200, and that could be as soon as the ship docks. It could be per day the ship is in port. It could be every time a visit is made. We'll get into that later. But this is the bottom line for invoicing for right now. In terms of how much and how frequently shipping contributes, this is the picture of the rate of return for those organizations. With 34 reporting, we have a median return rate of 51 and an average of about 53, which means, of course, that about half of the shippers or agents or port authorities pay when organizations request some sort of contribution. This is a very important thing here in the bottom line, that 6 centers or ministries with standing arrangements with shipping or port authorities have been excluded. We're going to get to them in a minute. But for people who don't have some sort of standing arrangement and kind of an agreement for support, this is what the picture looks like. And so in general, you can count on about half of your invoices being returned with a contribution. But of course, 20% here is the most frequent rate of response. Where does the invoice actually go? Who is going to be deciding whether payment is made or not? In the vast majority of cases, whether it's the Port Authority or the center doing the invoicing itself, it's going to go to the shipping agent, who of course represents the shipping line in that particular port. In some cases, the owners receive the invoice. That's really a minority of cases because it's very complicated to send your invoice off to a very distant office where no one really knows who you are or what's going on. The Port Authority receives the invoice in a very small amount of cases. Other is a very, we could almost exclude it. That, to my knowledge, is one center that has a standing arrangement with one line whose master does all the payment directly via cash. But in any case, agents are receiving most of the invoices. This is a very minor question, but how do you submit the invoice? Most people are doing it via email. Some do it via physical mail, sending it to the agent or wherever it's going to ultimately end up. But email, of course, is the most frequent use. How is payment made? Senders are just receiving checks from whoever is making the payment. EFT does, excuse me, EFT systems do exist in some situations, but there are a lot of reasons that centers have not adopted them. For one, there is a fee that has to be paid for every transaction. And another related problem is that it can be very complicated to set this up. There's frequently a lot of turnover within centers in terms of leadership and staffing, and so that sort of very complex but crucial system is difficult to set up. So we don't see EFT in very many cases. So most centers are just receiving a check from whoever is making the payment. Which gets us to this question: who is delivering the payment? Again, it's the agent who is doing it. In almost half the cases, the Port Authority makes some of the payments as well as the ownership. And again, the officer, that little green slice there, that pertains to that one particular case where the ship's master is making the payments via cash. But ultimately, agents are the ones who are doing most of the payment for welfare upkeep. This is one of those questions that gets at the difference between North American seafarers' welfare and the situation in the rest of the world. In the vast majority of centers and ministries, there are no restrictions on where that collected money can go. It just goes into a general operating fund. That 8.1% that does have a restriction, that's one center that puts all of their money to transportation costs, be they fuel or insurance or whatever for their vans. But in most cases, there is no restriction on where that money can go. We're going to get to why that's the case a little bit later on. In other parts of the world, the way that welfare money ends up being used is very highly regulated, but at least in North America, there is very little regulation on where that money can go. This is probably the most important aspect of collecting either levies or voluntary contributions. How much of your budget does the levy cover? Most people are looking at something under 10%. The average is 21, and the median is at 12%. So with numbers that low, you can tell that in many cases, the contributions aren't really doing all that much to the center's bottom line. Now, there are a few, those 55% down there at the bottom, where this sort of support is really make or break for the center. But for most people, it doesn't do a whole lot one way or the other. It's a nice bonus, but if it were to disappear, it wouldn't, it wouldn't really do a whole lot. But that also presents a lot of room for growth, which we will get to here in a second. We asked everyone that we talked with, do you think your system is adequate and successful? And it's a really open-ended question, but we like to have it that way because it let the people that we contacted answer in whatever way they saw appropriate. Most people think that it's fine, again, because it doesn't really represent that much of their budget, and so, it helps fill the coffers a little bit, but it's not that big of a deal. Others do not think that the system is working all that well. And what we found in those cases is that there was a real lack of coordination and mutual involvement on the part of everyone involved. So in a lot of the situations, you're looking at just centers sending out their invoices either to shipping agents or owners or whoever, kind of out of the blue, just sending a letter that says, we helped you, can you please send us some money? And that is not always the most productive way of going about things, as we'll get to here in a second. If the situation can be packaged and sold, maybe that's the wrong term because this is all very much how things really are. If we could convince ownership and port authorities that this is a mutually beneficial arrangement for everyone, that would really help increase both those rates of return and probably the amount that could be requested. Across the board, there really isn't that much of a sense of mutual responsibility for seafarers' welfare. If that could be If that could be increased, we think the things would be in much better shape. In terms of what is actually on the invoice, we collected a sample set of invoices from centers that do this sort of work to see how people do things, and we saw a wide variety of what people are sending to agents or companies or whoever. Some listings very detailed in terms of how many times they visited the ship, how many seafarers were transported either out to shopping or wherever, or came to visit the center, the days the ship was in port, that the Seafarer Center serviced the ship, this, that, and the other. In other cases, agents are just presented with a letter that says, we're here, we do nice things, can you please contribute to our upkeep? So most people do not provide a whole lot of specific services, but some do list them in very great detail. Some of the centers that we talk to really do very well in terms of this. They receive, if not a lot of money, then at least a consistent amount of support. And we started to notice some general patterns in what characterizes these successful collections. The most successful ones who have a 100% rate of return on their request all have a standing arrangement either with agents, authorities, or ownership, instead of a formal tariff or a levy as part of the tariff package in each port. You're going to see as we move through these examples that those standing arrangements, those personal relationships, are the most important part of this equation. Moving on from that, they do request on average about $76, we can call it $75 in support. That tends to be right where all their requests are. And then there's a real variety in terms of where they're sending it, whether it's to an agent, to an owner, or if they just have sort of an arrangement where the agent knows to send money every once in a while. That payment by special arrangement there on the third line. And then, of course, there's still a real variety in terms of how that payment is made and how it's actually collected. If we move down the chart a little bit to centers who get between 90 and 99% of their invoices back, they tend to request a little bit less in terms of support with each invoice. None of them have a standing arrangement with the agents, the authorities, or ownership, and so this is all done on a very sort of ad hoc basis, and there's no real arrangement by which these things happen. They do send their invoices to agents every time, and they do receive all their payments by check. And again, we'll see that that comes to be a common factor among collections. Now, what characterizes unsuccessful collections so far as we can determine? For those who have a rate of return between 50 and 70%, which isn't bad, but of course it's not up there in that 90% range, they tend to request on average $92. They do not have arrangements with the agents, the authorities, or ownership, and those tend to be the two things that are the real barriers there. They're asking for quite a bit of money, and nobody knows who they are. That's kind of what stands between them and a little bit better rate of return on their invoices. If we just say, well, I want to get at least half of my invoices back, what's going to get me there? Physical checks are the easiest thing to request because it doesn't require a center to set up EFT or an agent or an owner or whoever to deal with EFT. If you do the invoicing yourself as opposed to relying on the Port Authority to do, that's going to be a helpful factor, and sending it to the agent as well tends to be the way to get payment the most frequently. If we can offer just a few specific recommendations, this is where we see the future of setting up successful systems. Relationships are absolutely the most significant part of all of these schemes. If centers can build relationships with the agents and with the port authorities, that is kind of the three-person relationship that is going to make these systems work. Those relationships will allow centers to best explain what they do. It will allow them to explain that what they do benefits the shipping industry by making the seafarers much more productive and efficient and just happier people. And it helps the Port Authority by making the port a more hospitable place, and lines are going to want to come back there again and again and maybe not look to other ports that might have lower tariffs or whatever because of the excellent welfare services provided there. The amounts requested have to be reasonable. We are recommending about $75 per ship calling at port. If you think back to the chart of how much is requested, a couple of them were up in the very higher ranges, and that can be explained either by sort of overambition with how much is being requested, or by just the actual resources that go into providing these services. In some cases, the centers and the organizations have to drive a very long way to get to the port, and they have all these other expenses that go into it as well. So they have to ask for a lot just to cover all of that. Physical checks remain the most popular method of payment, but really the point is whatever makes it easiest for stakeholders to pay into the system is what should be done. If that means physical checks, then by all means keep doing that. If agents would prefer to do EFT or even PayPal or whatever, then set that up. Whatever makes it easiest for people to pay is the way to do it. And then finally, invoices should be clear and detailed, especially in outlining the services that are provided. Things like numbers of seafarers served, what day and time you showed up, where you took them, what services you provide at your center, how frequently you came to the ship. If you came on board the ship for a visit, did you sell SIM cards? Did you conduct services? Did you provide counseling? Whatever. If you can sort of quantify those things, it makes what seafarers welfare organizations do much more tangible and much more meaningful. Everybody gets requests for charitable contributions all the time. And it doesn't matter how nicely you put it, if it's vague and doesn't have any real meaning, people are much less likely to contribute. If we can show shipping and port authorities that what we are doing is important, it helps, and it has a real impact. You know, if you can say, I transported 15 seafarers to the center and 5 of them called home, whatever. I came on board and sold 10 SIM cards, that sort of thing. That puts a number on your services, and even if there is some quibbling over whether those services are worth whatever you're recommending, at least it puts a number to it and makes it much more tangible to ownership. That's what I've got prepared. Those are the results of our survey thus far. We're still looking at some of the more detailed questions, but I think Jason mentioned that we're gonna do a little bit of a Q&A session here. So I'm happy to entertain whatever questions you might have, or whatever questions Jason might have, and turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Michael. I enjoyed the presentation. I do have some questions that do come up, but I'm just wondering if anyone else has questions. You can just raise your little hand, that I can turn your microphone on, and you can ask your question. So if you have a question about Michael's presentation today, raise your hand, ask a question, and I'd love to respond. So Don Bryant, you're Donald Bryant, you're on the air.
Okay, I was just wondering about asking the Port Authority for contributions. I'm pretty sure, I know we do shipping agencies and other organizations, but Port Authority, what is that like?
Yeah, sure, that's a great question. This works in one of two ways. In one way, the Port Authority can work as a middleman, and so what you will see, and this will probably come out in our formal report here over the next few months, what you will see is that some ports have built into their tariffs language that suggests shipping should contribute to welfare services. Now, in a lot of cases, there's no mechanism by which that can be enforced. But in the cases where ships do pay, they will pay the port for these welfare services as part of their tariff package, and then the Port Authority will then pass that money along to the welfare organization. That's where the relationships matter. If you can get that sort of thing written into the tariff package, that makes a huge difference. Another very interesting situation that obtains in at least one port that we know of is that the Port Authority makes a contribution for every ship that calls at port, and then attempts to collect from the ship as the Port Authority. What that means is that the welfare organization gets paid for every single ship. Whether shipping pays the Port Authority back or not, the Port Authority is contributing for each ship. And again, that's one of those things that if a relationship can be built to where the Port Authority understands that this is very important work that is being done, that kind of system can be put into place, which eliminates the need to rely on invoicing shipping directly entirely.
Anyone else have a question that they'd like to ask Michael? Michael, perhaps I can jump in here and say and just ask one of the questions. About half of our interns this summer are from Canadian seafarer centers. I'm wondering if you could say something about the difference between the way this levy system works in Canada and the way it works in the United States.
So just to go by the numbers, of course, we have a lot more American centers that we surveyed than Canadian centers. If you if you sort of look at proportionally within Canada and within the United States, there's not a whole terrible lot of difference in the systems that are at work there. One exception is that there is one Canadian port that has a mandatory levy as part of its services, and so every ship that comes in has to pay this as part of its tariff package. There's no getting out of it. Uh, One other qualitative difference between the Canadian situation and the American situation is that there are in several Canadian ports there are a couple more what's the right word for it, advanced or farther along proposals to construct port welfare committees or formal structures to collect this. But in terms of what is operating at present, there's not a whole terrible lot of difference between Canada and the United States.
Anyone else like to ask a question? Just raise your hand. Otherwise, I'll jump in again. Michael, right now we're just looking at one slice of the pie, one slice of fundraising, one might say. Did your research look at the other ways in which ports support seafarers' welfare? So, and I'd like to know if you haven't done that, just if you could give us some sense of how you would what ways forward, what things we should be looking at in the way forward. So I suppose Don Bryant's question had something to do with this, but the question would be that there are many ports that maybe don't have a developed port levy system. They don't really want to ask for money directly from ships, but what they do give is perhaps more significant, but in different ways. And so I'm wondering if this particular study looked at that at all. I don't think so, but the follow-up question would be, when you were doing this survey, did anybody mention those various other ways that ports give money that might not necessarily be direct money, but sort of give, and perhaps give substantially, but in different ways?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's that second part that you got at. We did not go into this survey looking for that sort of information, but it did come up very, very frequently. In many cases, for those organizations that are located within ports or very near the ports, they will be afforded free space by the Port Authority or very, very, very heavily subsidized rent rent on their leases. In some cases, even just having a pro forma rent of $1 a year or whatever. And this also means that they'll be running off of the port's power grid, using their utilities, that sort of thing, in which case the centers are not charged in a great many situations. For those centers that are not located within ports, still having that relationship with the Port Authority is very helpful because it can make it much easier just to move in and out of the port. Of course, there are very, very important regulations having to do with customs and security that everyone has to go through as they go in and out of a port. But if there is a relationship between the center and the Port Authority, that process can be made much easier. It's funny that you mentioned giving in other ways. In some cases, for those organizations that are located within port environments, the fact that they have free space, even if it's not luxurious or large or whatever, that can be a real make or break issue, because some organizations are running on such small budgets that if they had to pay rent or if they had to pay high utility bills, they would simply cease to function. And so, and a lot of times, that kind of in-kind exchange of support is crucial, even if there is no direct monetary support flowing from the Port Authority to the organization.
Anyone has a question? Otherwise, I'll follow up with a couple. My question is, did you run into, I once heard anecdotally that there was one seafarer center that turned down a port levy because they said the money that they receive from port levy and the rigmarole that it presents meant that they forfeited much more significant support in other ways from the port. That doing this port levy and the relatively small amount that it gives meant that they weren't getting the much more significant in-kind donations or other major support from these shipping lines. And I'm wondering if you heard that from anyone else, or if this was just one particular person. With everyone has their own opinion, so I'm just wondering if this is just one sole opinion, or if you ever heard that opinion that some are questioning whether the 10, 20, 30% they get from these levies is worth it.
Well, as you mentioned, there is a really broad range of opinions and thoughts about the future of levies and what systems should be in place. I did not hear anyone tell me that they would turn down a levy. What I did hear was that they may have tried it in the past, but they really aren't considering it in the future because the perception is that the Port Authority is so completely opposed to anything like that that it would be a waste of time to even bring it up. And in some cases, there is even a fear of bringing it up for fear of losing those intangible contributions. And this kind of gets at that question of co-responsibility, mutual responsibility for this work. Some centers, whether this is accurate or not, feel that they are just kind of tolerated by the Port Authority. They're tolerated by the shipping agents, and so they don't want to make any waves for fear that they're going to be essentially kicked out of the port. And so that, I know I keep circling back to this, but that is why the relationships are so important, because if we get around that kind of obstacle, whether it's real or just perceived.
Last 2 minutes. Anyone else like to ask a question to Michael Skaggs on this report? This is one aspect of seafarers' welfare that coming into it, I had no idea of when I was a chaplain and ship visitor. It's probably the very last thing I ever would have ever guessed about learning. But it's one of those things that not only is critically important for many seafarer centers, but the last question I would ask is to Michael is, how easy would you, when you looked at the invoices that people were sending out and the work that they were doing, talk again about the recommendations you would give for best practice. What are the common mistakes that people are making, and some of the easiest ways to correct them?
I think the most common mistake is not being clear about what is provided. We saw a number of invoices that sort of just said, we serve the seafarers of the port of whatever. And then there is a box at the bottom that says, $100 or whatever. That is, it comes from the right place, but it's not helpful at all, because if I'm a shipping agent and I get that, it looks like one more solicitation for a charitable contribution. And what's so remarkable is that this is a system that, at least on the center's end, would be so easy to implement. If you've got a computer and Microsoft Word, you can start doing this today. All you really have to do is the simple things like count the number of seafarers that are transported, keep an accurate log of when you go visit ships or when ships take advantage of your services. That sort of thing is very, very easy. Now, to zoom out a little bit, the biggest challenge that I think everyone has here is that there is so much lack of perception. There's so much lack of transparency on both sides of things. As far as shipping is concerned, the welfare provision is often not understood very well, at least in terms of at the agent level or even the officer level on ships. What we actually do is not very well known. On the other hand, we have all heard the stories and the statistics about how seafarers are a completely invisible population. And this is why soliciting these sorts of contributions is so important, because, as I'm sure all the interns have found out over the course of the summer, making the sort of pitch for fundraising outside of this very small community is extraordinarily difficult because people just don't know about seafarers. And so the system by which shipping can contribute directly through this sort of invoicing is so important because we have a real opportunity here to sell ourselves as very useful in a way that the general public just cannot understand. We have a lot farther way to go to explain it to them than we do to shipping.